This is the Fighting Through podcast. This is the Fighting Through podcast. This is the Fighting Through podcast. Great unpublished history.
This is indeed the Fighting Through podcast, episode 82, Coffee with Corporal Les Cook, part 2. More great unpublished history.
We didn't have enough food for ourselves in the mountains. We only had the food we could carry. I'd run out of ammunition and they threw up a haversack for me and I reloaded the magazines and so I'd always thought I should try and get them back. I shouldn't keep them as souvenirs. I had an obligation to get them back to the family.
Hello again, and another exciting World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. That was our beloved Les introducing this show in his inimitable fashion, following his coaching course on the previous episode. And thanks, Les, for being such a good sport in allowing me to pick that up off the cutting room floor. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through, from Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to give you the stories behind the story and much more. You'll hear memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. Just a quick bit of feedback I've had from Tony Trobe, Les's son-in-law. He says Anzac Day went well, with Les leading the march at the National War Memorial here in Canberra, still able to walk up a hill. It's quite a big deal, with the government, general and senior politicians attending. The media all seem to want to have a piece of him, including his granddaughter Sophie, who works for one of the major commercial TV channels. I'll tell you what, I think we've probably had more of Les than all the TV channels put together, so how good is that? This episode, we've got another full interview with Les, and without further ado, I'm going to go straight into it. When the war started, you went over to for your training in... No, it was Greece, wasn't it? You trained?
Yes.
At some point, it must have become clear to you that there was a threat from Japan invading Australia, and as I understand it, the route they were going to come was across New Guinea along the Kokoda Trail. Is that right?
Well, it's always been said since the war that in studying all the Japanese information, they never intended to invade Australia.
Okay.
But they were opportunists, and if they could have done, I'm sure they would have done, and the American Navy stopped them.
Okay.
And their Air Force too. Within 6 months almost of the Japanese coming into the war, the US Navy and Air Force dominated them. The Battle of Midway in the island in the middle of the Pacific, they sunk all the Japanese aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
In the middle of 1942.
4th to the 7th of June 1942.
And the Japanese couldn't have gone anywhere after then. Britain was stopping them in Burma and India, and Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral, he had warned the Japanese government if they didn't defeat the Americans completely at Pearl Harbor, the American factories would produce a lot more than the Japanese could, and the Japanese would lose. He'd warned them of that, and at Pearl Harbor, there were aircraft carriers that the Americans had at Pearl Harbor, but one was going to the island of Guam, delivering aircraft there. The Americans controlled that island, and then others were around the back of the island doing some training exercises. So they weren't in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese fleet attacked.
Okay.
So they survived, and the Battle of Midway, the Americans sunk their carriers. Borneo was, the Americans had gone back to the Philippines before then. We were training to go to the Philippines with the Americans, but MacArthur, the American general, he wouldn't allow us to, it had to be all American.
Paul, just to jump in there,
Yeah.
The Kokoda Campaign, the Owen Stanley Campaign, was long before Borneo. That was often thought of the defence of Australia. So that's the reason why that the troops were brought back, was ostensibly to defend Australia. I think they were sent home, and then there was a bit of biffo between Churchill and Curtin about where they were going to go.
Yeah.
They wanted to send them to Burma or something, but then they just came straight back. And that was the campaign Les was involved in, was the Kokoda one.
If the Japanese had landed in New Guinea, and initially they tried to come around by sea, through the Coral Sea, and take Port Moresby from the sea. And the US fleet stopped that. And the Japanese then landed on the north coast and came over the mountains to attack from the land, and that was what the so-called Kokoda Campaign was.
Right.
And it's not impossible that if we get information years after the event, but the Japanese General Hirai, he had Kokoda's about 60 miles inland from the sea, and he had said they shouldn't start over the mountains until they had 10 days' supply. And there was no road that trucks could go over. They had horses and people to carry the stores to Kokoda from the coast.
Yeah.
And he'd worked out that 10 days' supply would be enough for them to take Port Moresby on the other side. And the battles that took place above Kokoda held them up for 4 days. So they were starving by the time they got to the hills above Port Moresby, because there's no food in the jungle. There's no animals. There's white ants and centipedes and snakes and things like that.
Wow.
But if we had not held them for those 4 days above Kokoda, they may have taken Port Moresby, and if they'd done that, there were some big airfields at Port Moresby. They would have been able to use them and bomb down the east coast as far as Sydney, and perhaps the Americans would have decided then not to go north from Australia. They decided to go north from Hawaii, and so the Japanese could have taken Australia then.
So that was quite a crucial piece of a crucial campaign, wasn't it, from Australia's point of view?
Well, yes, it was. The Americans were on Guadalcanal, the island, and we'd retreated to the mountains about 30 miles from Port Moresby. It was. We'd retreated to there because they outnumbered us 10 to 1.
Wow.
And those original Japanese were very well trained. They're people who'd fought in China and fought in other places. They were highly trained and very aggressive. And dying for the emperor was a creditable thing to do.
Yeah.
And they got to the range about 30 miles from Port Moresby, And at that time, the Americans on Guadalcanal, the island, they had defeated the Japanese there, and the head of the Japanese army in the south, he was afraid that because the Americans had been successful on the island of Guadalcanal, that we would land troops on the north coast of New Guinea and cut them off, the ones who were up in the mountains. And Harai was ordered to retreat from that position above Port Moresby.
Yeah.
Harai, he was drowned a bit later on when they were escaping.
What were the sorts of actions that you were involved in the campaign?
There were, we fought several rearguard actions. There was Isharava at Templar's Crossing and Arabawa Ridge. There were probably about 6 delaying actions to hold the Japanese up. And it was a fairly untidy arrangement. And as I say, by the time they got there, they were starving just about. And because up until then, coming down through Malaya and Singapore, when they captured a place, they captured unlimited amount of rations, the food. We didn't have enough food for ourselves in the mountains. We only had the food we could carry. And for several months there in the mountains, that was salted tin meat we called bully beef.
Oh, yeah.
There were 12-ounce tins, and one of those a day was our rations.
Yeah.
Sometimes we didn't even get that. But when they drove us off the range, they didn't capture any food because there wasn't any there.
Wow. There were 1 or 2 instances in your stories of the Japanese infiltrating your camp.
Oh, no, that was in Borneo.
That was Borneo, was it? Oh. Got one right then.
that was years later, and we had captured a Japanese airfield near the Mangar River in South Borneo, and it was quite a bit inland from the sea, but I forget now, but it was. It wouldn't have been more than a couple of kilometres from the sea, but following the capture of the airfield...
Following the capture of the airfield?
There was a low mountain range running behind the airfield, and the Japanese had naval guns mounted in turrets along there, along the side of the airfield. And the Navy, our Navy and the Air Force had been unable to silence those guns, and so the day that we captured the airfield, we went into these mountains and captured the mountains, and including these naval guns, and our function was to blow them up, and they were in turrets.
They were in turrets.
Or they were handmade protective devices that were like a small hill, and the gun fired out the side of it. And when we first got up there, I was a Bren gunner at the time, and we were just put in. I was behind a log. We didn't have time to dig holes or prepare a defence line, and the night came along, and we hadn't, things had quietened down, but the night came along and it started to rain, and these Japanese then set out to infiltrate us, because, of course, they knew every inch of the land because they'd probably lived there for years.
Yeah.
And there was a position just on over my right shoulder was where the turret rose to where the gun position was, and there was a weapon pit dug on the top of there that they had in their defence system, and I was just in the open lying behind the log, and when we suddenly discovered what was happening, that they had decided to infiltrate us, we didn't know, but there were two of them, two Japanese, got up in this position, which was about probably 3 metres at the most from where I was, and the light wasn't very good in the night and raining, but I felt aware that they were there, and the only thing I could have done just about was throw a grenade up there, but if it hadn't gone in the hole, it would have rolled back down onto me. So I couldn't do that, and I went to pick up the brand new machine gun, and it had folding legs under it, and when I went to pick it up, the legs emitted a loud click, and I don't know if I did see this, but in my imagination perhaps I saw these two heads stiffen at the sound of the click and looking down at me, and I didn't have another try at that, so we sat there for I don't know how long it was, some hours, and the Navy, having been told of our position, they fired some star shells over us, that our Navy, and it wasn't like daylight, but it's very strong light in the sky that lit up the ground, and so that we could sort out where they were.
Yeah.
And anyway, they got away before I was able to do anything.
I wonder if your gun clicking actually spooked them and made them realise that somebody was stalking them, and actually did it.
Well, it was the only way that they would have known that I was there, because I hadn't been firing because we weren't under attack.
Yeah.
They just sort of got in amongst us, and if it hadn't been for the Navy firing these star shells, we wouldn't have known what was happening. They knew every inch of the country, we didn't.
Yeah.
So it was one of those, looking back, it's hard to say whether that's actually I did see them or whether it was just imagination.
That sounds like a scary standoff, nonetheless.
Because there wasn't anything I could do. They were just looking down on me.
Yeah.
But I suppose looking down, you wouldn't see as much as looking up with the sky at the back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no, it was a long period of tension, because if we'd been attacked from the front and I'd started firing, well, I wouldn't have lasted 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Would I?
Yeah.
Later on that night, there was some fighting around, and I'd run out of ammunition, and they threw up a haversack of ammunition for me, and I reloaded the magazines, and when I opened up, it was tracer ammunition, but I don't know why they had tracer ammunition. Every time I fired, everybody could see where the firing was coming from. And that was embarrassing.
God. Can I move on to another subject? Because I'd like to ask you about souvenirs from your war. Is there any particular souvenir that's a big standout? I've given you a big clue there, but Deb will no doubt nudge you.
The machete?
Oh, that, well, my platoon commander was killed, and it was customary to take something of them. In the last campaign, we'd never had it before. Our machetes were probably, the blade would be pretty well 60 centimetres long, and but the officers were issued with short ones. The blade would be about 250 millimetres long. That's 10 inch, isn't it?
Yeah.
And anyway, I still have that machete that belonged to Frank Doyle, the officer.
Oh, wow.
And I also have a steel spearhead that the blade's about 150 millimetres long. The Japanese, there were, at night, they didn't throw them, they used them as lances. Wow. They had rifles and bayonets, but the rifles and bayonets had been found leaning against a tree, and they'd come in with these lances, and a friend of mine, they rushed at him, and the lance went just through the skin on the side of his neck, and he was able to shoot the person who was using it. But I collected one of them the following day and cut the handle off so I could just carry the blade, and I still have that. But I don't look at this anymore. And I have had I picked up a lot of bits of paper. I've got Japanese. I've got quite a lot of Italian badges from the North African campaign in the first 2 months of 1941. Just they were quite ornate. They're regimental badges.
Yeah.
And I've got a handful of them, or 20 or something.
This might, as in souvenirs, or souvenirs probably isn't the right word, but it might lead into the story of the Japanese doll, which started with you finding a flag and the diary.
Oh, when we broke through at Goda on the 8th of December 1942, that we had to bury the dead, and our dead and theirs, and it was customary then, if you have those words, it was customary to collect any documents and things of interest so the intelligence people could go through them and get information from them. But one of the people that I was buried with another man, I got a diary, a small diary, and the Japanese flag. That early lot of Japanese soldiers, a lot of them carried this flag. It was about 60 centimetres square and of white silk, and with the Japanese red emblem in the centre. And we were told, I can't read Japanese, we were told that there were good luck charms and things that friends and neighbours had written around on the white silk. And he had both these things. And, that story of the Yasukuni Shrine tells this story in detail, that I showed them to the intelligence people, and they said, "Oh, you can keep them. We've got lots of stuff." And so I took them home, and I gave a lot of my material to the Australian War Memorial, and I'd kept them because when we were in Japan in the occupation force, at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo is a shrine where the Japanese believe that the spirits of Japanese men who die in battle congregate at the Yasukuni Shrine. And it was one of the places where we had a guard, and I was talking to a Japanese officer who could speak English, and he was a member of the staff at the shrine, and I told him the story, and he explained to me then the importance the Japanese people place on their Remembrance Day once a year, that they to have something in their hands that was with the person when they died. So I'd always thought I should try and get them back. I shouldn't keep them as souvenirs. I had an obligation to get them back to the family.
Yeah.
That would have been in 1946. And I think it had been probably nearly 20 years later that I was able to get them back to the family. And we met the man's sister was the only one alive. And we were going to Britain, and we went via Japan so we could see them. And my wife had crocheted a white woolen shawl for the man's sister, but we didn't see her. And it was from the letters that I had from her daughter-in-law. They thought it was marvellous that we looked after them. Firstly, that we buried them, because the people in Japan thought that you don't bother burying the enemy, you bury your own. And certainly the Japanese didn't bury our dead. So they thought it was very noble of us to bury the dead.
Yeah.
And
not such dishonourable people after all then, eh? The Japanese used to regard us as being somewhat dishonourable, didn't they?
Oh, yes.
So
the Japanese, they had a very high code of honour. It was better to kill yourself than to surrender in war. And they did. They were cruel, but they were still highly
honourable.
Maybe you might like to just mention about the doll, how after you'd met with with them in Japan. How?
Yeah, well, we had gone after we'd left Japan. We'd spent a few hours with the family, part of the family, one night, and we went on to Britain. It was 3 months later, I think, when we got home, and there was this doll that they had sent us as a thank you for returning these articles. No, the family was very impressed. Not only the family, it was a fact known over Japan. People knew that we were there for that reason.
There were articles in the newspaper.
There are newspaper articles, yes. Yeah. I've often wondered if I should give a copy of that story to the ambassador for Japan here at Canberra.
Wow, I'm sure
I think he'd be interested in it.
Cool, yes. I think it's a wonderful story because it proves that you weren't such a dishonourable race. It's all down to different standards, isn't it? But they wouldn't bury our dead, but you buried theirs, and proved a point really. But it's such a poignant outcome that they were touched so much by your gesture that they then sent you the doll.
I didn't see it as an unusual thing to do. I saw it as the proper thing to do. That it would have been wrong of me to keep them as souvenirs.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Oh, well, that's lovely. Les has previously written quite an extended story about this Japanese doll. And I've decided, rather than try and include it in this episode, I'm going to crack on and do another episode fairly soon after this one with a full Japanese doll story and one or two others that I've dug up that I'd kept back from the main set. So we'll pick that up again later. Les, did you use your learnings from the war in any sense after in your work?
No, not in that sense, but the experience, it was a valuable experience, probably, I think, the war. And I was lucky. But no, I just actually coming back for 7 years, I'd been told what clothes to wear and what to do. And all of a sudden I had to make up my own mind.
Yeah.
It was a struggle getting back to civil life where you have to decide what coloured tie to wear with what coloured suit. We didn't ever have that problem. We were told what to wear.
Yeah.
And I'd been sort of 7 years. I grew up in the AIF, and that was a bit of a stress. That life went back to normal. That at an Anzac Day meeting once years later, we're being interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist said to me, "How do you want Australia to remember you?" And I said, "Why would Australia remember me?" And asked the next man, and he said, "I want to be remembered as somebody who saved Australia." I couldn't have answered that right.
Yeah, it's funny, but funnily enough, you'll be remembered, obviously by your family, but certainly by me and everybody who listens to this podcast or reads the website and sees all your memoirs. You're gonna last forever, really. When I do these podcast episodes, I sometimes joke and pretend that the person who's listening to it is listening to it in 100 years' time. And I truly believe that my podcast, long after I'm dead and gone, there will be still people dipping into my podcast. And when I leave this earth, I want to try and make sure that the records are there, that, people will have access to them. So, you'll, in that spirit, if I succeed in that, then you'll be part of that.
Oh, but my dad was 3 years in the First War. He was, of course, I had my second birthday on the boat coming out to Australia from England. And Dad was with the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment and serving in the Middle East for 3 years. And he knew what war was.
Yeah.
And at the time of Dunkirk, when the British Army was evacuated from France, when I was going to enlist, and he was in hospital, he'd had an operation and an injury at work, and when I told him, he said, "Yeah, well, I will when I get out of here too," because either the doctors had told him or he misunderstood them that he had a blood clot in one leg as a result of the operation, and he should take a sedentary job because if the clot moved, it could go to his heart and he'd have a heart attack, or go to his brain and he'd have a stroke.
Yeah.
And he said, "So if it's going to kill me, I might as well have another hit before I die." And he enlisted too. And he must have forgotten to tell the recruiting officers about the blood clot.
Yeah.
So he was 6 years in the Second War.
How old was he when he died? I mean, obviously he survived the war, didn't he?
Yes, well, yeah, that's a rather humorous point there. When I turned 80, my sister said to me, "Dad died when he was 81, and his father died when he was 81, and you're 80.
Yeah, and you're still trespassing.
80 years later.
But there are some humorous things, Paul. And again, the journalists come around us a lot and referred to this man as soldiers. And the man laughed. He said, "We weren't soldiers in the AIF. We were heavily armed civilians."
Ah, yes, yeah, yeah,
And that's a great definition.
yeah. How did you find your officers? Were they your officers? Were they aloof or were they pretty decent towards you?
No, they were separate in their living. You didn't call your officer by a Christian name,
no.
But you had to give them outward respect. And our officers were very good. In the early days of the war, most of our officers had been in the First World War because there were only 20 years difference.
Yeah.
And so they were nearly all First War officers. And then in the early days of our war, as the years went by, sergeants who were considered to be suitable to become officers were sent to officers' training school and they became officers.
Yeah.
And we didn't have any incompetent officers because if they weren't able to do their job properly, they were sent back to some other task.
Yeah.
You had to be a good officer to be kept there.
Okay. I've got many favourite stories from Les's archival memoirs, but the one which comes to mind instantaneously was the one when Les found an ancient coin in the desert. In your papers, you recounted a story of being in the desert and finding an ancient coin inside an underground building, an underground reservoir of some sort.
Oh, yes.
And that's just captured my imagination because there's one of my listeners, Paolo Bondini. Sorry, that should be Bonini. Sorry, Paolo. Wrote in a few weeks ago. And he's exploring the ancient temples and buildings of Cambodia and all sorts. And it's just funny, the things he's described, which I'm going to take up in a future show. It just captures exactly what you were doing, going into this underground building and to find that coin. Have you still got the coin?
Oh, yes, I still have it.
You still have it?
Well, I've been told it's a coin. It has the Roman Caesar's head on one side of it.
Oh, wow.
And the writing on it is Italian, I think. And I've never bothered. One of our daughters did take it to a coin expert, and he told her what it was. And but that intrigued me. That it's about halfway between Bardia and Tobruk in North Africa. That it had been an ancient city.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the city was.
That was my next question. Did you ever find out where it was? Because you expressed doubt as to where it was at the time, or after the war you couldn't remember where it was. But you said if you were standing on a hilltop looking down on it, you would recognise it.
Yes, I would. I would certainly recognise it if there's a cliff face type of thing that it's about 30 miles inland, and it runs more or less parallel with the coast at that point. And the ruins of the city, you can see that where the streets were and the buildings, and they're not worn down to the sand. I don't think their roofs have just gone and the sand has filled them up.
Yeah.
And it must be well known to anybody who flies over it.
Yeah. I'll make sure Paolo gets all these details that you have got, and we'll set him on the scent. Might make a change to explore. What is this? Is the Egyptian desert? Is it? Oh, the sort of the North African desert.
It had been in Libya in those days.
Yeah.
Because the border was at the top of Hellfire Pass behind the town of Saloum, the border between Libya and Egypt.
Yeah. It's just to think that coin you found, unless somebody in modern times had dropped it, that means it was probably there, laying there for 2,000 years.
Yes.
Wow.
But that's a very long time ago.
You can hear the full story of that coin discovery in episode 67.
Just recently, it's 80 years ago that the Greece campaign, 1941. So 80 years. It's funny thing, Paul, that when I sat down writing the stories, things that had been not even apparent in my mind came back to me. Writing is a lot easier than talking.
You seem to be well equipped to do both, if you don't mind me saying. And I mean that in the most complimentary fashion.
So I'm not experienced at this sort of thing at all.
I think you are. You're doing all right. Let me ask. I've got two more little topics I'll just touch upon, because these are two of my favourite stories. One's scary and one's just hilarious. And the first, I'll do the scary one first. How's your driving these days? Are you still driving or not? Are you giving up driving?
No.
The point of my question, really, Les, was I was just teasing you in a way, because another tease question is, can you still remember how to double declutch?
The first car I had, it was a 1935 Hudson Terraplane, an American car.
Right.
And it had a crash gearbox. There was no synchro mesh on the gearbox. The brakes were cable brakes. They weren't hydraulic. And
wow.
I had taught my wife to drive in that car.
Yeah.
And she was able to do the double declutching and stuff. That it was quite a novelty to get a car that had synchro mesh gears.
What about driving a lorry or an army truck with full of troops in the back?
I did that once in Greece, but
I know you did.
I don't know about driving it, but no, I didn't. After Crete, because a lot of the German paratroops had motorcycles, small ones, and we all had to learn how to ride a motorcycle after that, right, in case we came up against it again.
Oh, wow. Well, I've recounted your story about double declutching the lorry gears going down the hill to try and slow it down before you...
Oh, that was in Greece, yes. Yeah.
So they'll know all about that.
The officer turned the truck around for me.
Yeah. And
there would have been 20 men in the back of it.
Yeah.
In those days, very few people in Australia had a car, and so very few of us were able to drive. But I'd had a friend in the transport section who showed me how to change gears. And, well, he said, can anybody drive? And, and I said, well, I'd had this training in changing gears and stuff, but that was all. I'd never driven a vehicle. And it was either that or the truck and the people could be left behind.
Yeah. Wow.
So I know the bloke alongside me, he was about to open the door and jump out.
You didn't really get the full story from Les there, but we got the idea. But would you like to hear the full story now? It's only a short one. Yeah. You would? Oh, go on then. Twist my arm. Here goes. Thank you, Paul. You do treat us, don't you? Right. This is just an extract from the story. You got the gist of it from Les. This is called Learning to Drive, March 41, during the retreat from Greece. Overwhelmed by the German numbers, superior firepower and absolute air superiority, we started the retreat that was to end with the evacuation of Greece. Detached from my own unit, I fell in with a miscellaneous collection of Australians under the command of a captain. We were transported in trucks, if trucks could be made available. If not, we were marched carrying all our gear, hoping always that we'd meet up with trucks somewhere along the way. The major vehicle fleet was controlled by the transport companies, and there's no doubt that they responded to requests as well as they were able, but the number of trucks was small. The requests were many, and the drivers soon became exhausted from lack of sleep. Continuous enemy air attacks made the roads virtually unusable during daylight, except when there was low cloud, so most of the driving was done at night. I don't know how it happened, but when we started to board the trucks, it was found that we were short of one driver. It was almost dark and vital that we leave at once. The captain, who was going to drive one of the trucks himself, asked if there was anyone among us who could drive. There was silence. I said that if nobody else was more able than me, I was prepared to give it a go if the others were willing to take the risk. Again, there was silence. The truck was facing the wrong way on a narrow road with a very long drop onto the trees below on one side and a cliff on the other. The road was about as wide as 1.5 times the length of the truck, and I wasn't prepared to turn it around in that limited space with a frightening drop at the edge. The captain turned the truck around, set the handbrake and left the motor idling. We all got in and the convoy set off, with the truck I was driving in the middle of the convoy. The gears didn't have synchromesh, so it was necessary to double declutch when changing gears, particularly when changing down. Brakes weren't nearly as efficient then as they are now, so it was essential to have the truck in low gear when descending a steep hill. If the steepness of the hill increased, of course, it was necessary to select a lower gear to control the speed of the vehicle. Driving in convoy at night without lights is in itself a nerve-wracking business. To be an inexperienced driver as I was, it was even more traumatic. Fortunately, we weren't travelling at much more than walking speed on this narrow mountain road, but it was necessary to keep the truck in front in sight without being so close as to run into it. Our only indicator that we were still together and on the right road was the dim vision of that truck in front. The truck windscreens were in 2 pieces, with a dividing pillar in the centre. It had become common practice to smash the glass on the passenger side, and for the passenger to have a Bren gun with its legs standing on the bonnet to discourage any unauthorised vehicles from joining the convoy. Such is the paranoia of war, particularly in a retreating army, that it was a somewhat hazardous business for an honest Greek farmer going about his lawful occasions to try to break into the military convoy at night, or for that matter even in daylight. After coming down off the worst of the mountains, the road was straighter. The moon had come out and we'd increased speed a little, and I was starting to feel quite confident in my ability. We were on a long downhill run approaching a small village when the slope of the road suddenly increased and the truck started to get away from me. There was a sharp turn in the road just before it entered the village, and it was apparent even to my inexperienced eye that unless I could slow the truck down, we were not going to be able to take that turn. I can't remember what the alternative would have been. With all my weight on the brake pedal and concentrating on holding the vehicle on a straight course with my right hand, I declutched and fumbled in the dark for the gear lever to change to a lower gear. Having shifted the gearbox into neutral, I tried to change down by increasing the engine revs in an attempt to match its speed to the speed of the wheels, but missed the lower gear, and by this time our speed had increased alarmingly. The man alongside me in the passenger seat, opened the door preparatory to jumping from the truck before it was too late. While this reaction undoubtedly was a natural and understandable response to our situation, I can remember that his obvious lack of faith did little to boost my waning confidence. Indeed, I felt that he was about to desert me in my time of need. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I managed to find the lower gear in time to slow the vehicle before we reached the corner. Fortunately, for the peace of mind of those in the back of the truck, they couldn't see what was happening because of the canopy, and were unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. From that being scary but also funny, I'll ask you one final question it's not a question, an observation. One of my favourite stories was about, I think you said in some of your stories that the Japanese loved to make a lot of noise before they attacked. And there was one incident where they were all revving up for an attack.
Yeah.
Go on, you take over.
This was the early Japanese.
Yeah.
The first Japanese we struck were much more determined, and they subsequently, they were all brave men. They were all prepared to die, but they'd been at war for years, that first crowd we struck. But they were noisy. They like blowing whistles and yelling out and stuff. I think in the First World War, people used to make shouting when they were in attack on both sides, I believe.
This particular story I was thinking about was when they were doing this, and you were all waiting patiently for them to attack, and they carried on making their noise, and some wag at the back of your ranks shouted, "Come on, yous lot, if you're going to attack, then get on with it." And the Japanese shut up because they didn't understand it. And everybody laughed, and it gave you all a good lift at a time when morale was a bit low.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that, but we had some good humourists with us.
Again, I'm going to give you an extract from this story where Les is saying, "We had successfully repelled several attacks in the pouring rain on the first night, but our future was starting to look a bit doubtful. We were surrounded and outnumbered. Our ammunition was running low, and we couldn't withstand another really determined attack. Time was running out for us. It must have been about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when they were forming up again and carrying on with their shouting preparatory to attacking, that we heard an Australian voice call. 'If you's gonna have a go, don't stand there all night talking about it.' This unexpected call from our side obviously threw the enemy into some confusion. They immediately lapsed into silence, apparently trying to work out the significance to them of this one strange cry. I never found out who was responsible. Perhaps the man himself didn't survive the night. Looking back on it now, however, the very homeliness of the expression and its rough delivery was a morale booster for us at the time when we could certainly do with one. Such men are worth their weight in gold in times of stress." Thank you, Les.
Paul, could I jump in? I think the General MacArthur story is one worth just a little amusing one.
Yeah,
Les,
go on then.
Your beach landing, Les, at Abbott. Tell that story, yeah.
Well, the day we landed at Balikpapan, we'd been ashore for a few hours, and we were waiting for one of the other battalions to take a feature on our left side to allow us to move forward. And MacArthur came ashore, and he had an entourage of people with him and photographers and stuff, and he didn't speak to anybody. He just walked through.
He just walked through and straight past us all. We were under
bit of machine gun fire, but from a long distance, and the bullets were a long way apart. And he walked up onto the hill and had his field glasses, and he was standing on the hill, looking through the field glasses, and the jungle rose up in front of him like a solid wall. And he stood there while the photographers were taking his pictures. And our brigadier, Ivan Doherty, he was trying to get him off the mountain.
He was trying to get him off the mountain.
He didn't want to get him killed when he was with us. And anyway, when the photographers had done their job, MacArthur turned around and went back down the hill again and back onto the ship. But I don't know what he achieved other than having photographs taken. Somebody yelled out at him, "Sit down, you mug, you're drawing the crabs." Because it was assumed that he was attracting the Japanese fire.
Yeah.
And yes, I'd forgotten that. Anyway, he just walked back. He never spoke to anybody. And,
that's not good, is it?
Yes, that's right.
I asked Les if he read much.
Kipling was quite a intellectual individual. That he says, these aren't his actual words, but he says, when all the men who do great deeds have done them, and all the people who write about those great deeds will have written about them, we will be left only with words to tell us how people in the past lived. And this is the critical line, is it? We do not know whose words they will be. The victor in a war writes the history.
Ah, okay.
and they write it praising themselves.
Yeah. Do you know, you've just given me a great finish to the interview.
I think he was a great philosopher, I think, Kipling. He's marvellous.
Well, Les, I'm clean out of questions now. So I'm going to draw it to a close and just say thank you for your service, because you've done us proud. So anyway, well done, Les, and thank you very much. And thank you, Tony and Deb. Much appreciate it. Really, really brilliant.
Should tell you all that I was born in the village of Aston Ingham in Herefordshire.
Were you?
Yes.
So you're a Brit, you go.
In 1923, and I had my second birthday on the boat coming to Australia.
God. So you're a Brit?
No.
Well, he's got a British
I'm an Australian.
You feel Australian and you're Australian.
Mate that I spent a lot of time with during the war, Dick Hill from Western Australia, he and I had sat in the hole in the night for hours talking, filling in time. We'd talk politics, religion, every subject in the world. After he died, and the requiem, the thing that was read out at his funeral, he was born in England, and so was I, but we never discussed it.
Oh, wow.
We weren't ashamed of it.
We just didn't get round to it.
In the American senior State Department in the USA.
In America, I was once talking to a guy in the State Department in the USA.
Talking to him once, and he said, I'm an Irish American. And I said, oh, you were born in Ireland? And he said, no, my great-great-grandfather came out 200 years ago.
Wow.
And I said, well, aren't you just an American? And there's no such thing as an English American.
Okay, we're gonna let Paul go here.
All right.
Otherwise, we'll be here for hours.
Well, take care, guys. It was lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you, Paul. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Paul. Bye.
Bye, Les. Take care. Les, this episode is far from finished. I've got some PSs coming up, but I want to pause to thank you so much for your service during the war and well beyond, indeed the rest of your life. Your memoirs were unique and priceless, and you certainly must have worked hard in pulling them together. Thanks also to your daughter Deb and son-in-law Tony for supporting you in the interview and laughing at just the right time at all the jokes. Listener, thank you so very much for your support and for making the time to listen to me, and please keep in touch howsoever it pleases you. Above all, enjoy, and please do hear me next time. Talking about which, here's a short preview of the next episode, and it's what I've decided to squeeze into what you might call a bonus episode. It wasn't planned this way, but Les has produced so much material it would be unforgivable of me not to let you hear it. And this is the story of the Japanese doll. So here's a brief preview. An exquisitely dressed doll in a glass case stands in a prominent place in our home in Canberra. About 40 centimetres tall, this figure is of a girl in traditional Japanese costume. Its striking beauty has always attracted the attention of visitors. As I gaze at it today, my thoughts take me back almost 60 years to the fever-ridden coastal swamps of New Guinea. In my mind's eye, I see the desolate scene again so vividly and in such detail that for a moment I feel as though I'm actually there. I hear the incessant rattle of rifle and machine gun fire. I sense the oppressive heat and humidity and the cloying stench, and I feel the numbing tiredness that dulls all sensation, even fear. I see the gaunt, exhausted faces of my mates, and I remember those who are gone. With the sentimentality that comes when we grow old to those who've lived through desperate battles, I'm saddened by the awful human cost of war. You'll hear the full story of the Japanese doll next episode. I've got 2 PSs coming up for you now. Firstly, I've got a bit more poetry for you. Not poetry written by Les, but a particular rhyme that he took a shine to. But I'll warn you now, it's quite spooky, and not for the faint-hearted. And we've got Les's spoken commentary on the meaning of it. As usual, I've got 1 or 2 extra tales to tell, and there's one about Curly O'Grady and his charitable contributions. Here we go. So here's another Les Cook story, a poem that missed his first season of Tales from the Far East. I think it's about the schizophrenia that can kick in when you're all alone in the wilderness of the Aussie outback. It's called There's Only 2 of Us Here. So listener, get cosy in an armchair with a coffee or a Calvados and try to find someone whose hand you can hold, because this is a bit spooky. I camped one night in an empty hut by the side of a lonely hill. I didn't go much on empty huts, but the night was awful chill. So I boiled me billy and had me tea and seen that the door was shut. And I went to bed in an empty bunk by the side of the old slab hut. It must have been about 12 o'clock. I was feeling cosy and warm, when at the foot of the bunk I see a horrible, ghostly form. It seemed in shape to be half an ape, with a head like a chimpanzee. But what the hell was it doing there? And what did it want with me? You may say if you please that I had DTs, or call me a crimson liar, but I wish you'd seen it as plain as me, with its eyes like coals of fire. It gave a moan and a horrible groan that curdled me blood with fear. And there's only 2 of us here, it said. There's only 2 of us here. I had one eye on the old hut door and one on the awful brute, I only wanted to dress myself and get to the door and scoot. But I couldn't find where I'd left me boots, so there wasn't a way to clear. And there's only two of us here, it said. There's only two of us here. I hadn't a thing to defend myself, not even a stick or stone. And there's only two of us here, it said, again, with a horrible moan. I thought I'd better make some reply, though I reckoned me end was near. By the holy smoke, when I find me boots, there'll be only one of us here. Then I got me hands on me number 10s, and out through the door I scoots, and I lit the whole of the hillsides up with the sparks from me blucher boots. I haven't slept in a hut since then, and I tremble and shake with fear when I think of that horrible brute that moaned, "There's only two of us here." I've done a bit of digging and I discovered that Edward Harrington wrote that poem, and according to Wikipedia he died in 1966 and was generally referred to as the last of the Bush balladists. And I understand that free use can be made of this poem, but not for profit causes, so I think I'm okay there. I reckon the guy had a mirror at the bottom of his bed, so when he saw the chimpanzee in the low light, he was looking at himself, unless you listener know better. But as a final note on the subject, here's what Les had to say about the poem. You had a poem about something like only the two of us.
There's only two of us here. I camped one night in an empty hut by the side of an old hill. I don't go much on empty huts, but the night was awful chill. So I boiled my billy and had my tea and saw that the door was shut, and I went to bed in an empty bunk by the side of the old slab hut. It must have been about 12 o'clock. I was feeling cosy and warm, when at the foot of the bunk I saw a horrible ghostly form. It seemed in shape like half an ape with a head like a chimpanzee. But I wondered what it was doing there, and what the hell did it want with me? Anyway, this strange thing at the end of the bed says, "There's only two of us here," it said, "there's only two of us here." And through the poem later on, he said he couldn't find his boots to get out and run away. He said, "If I could get hold of my blucher boots, there'd be only one of us here." And the poem ends up then with he'd never ever get in sleep in an empty hut ever again. It's an Australian poem, and I do know the words.
The question I wanted to ask you about it was what does it mean? I mean, obviously it's somebody having a nightmare in bed, but what?
It doesn't mean anything. It's just a story.
Okay.
It's, a lot of poems don't have meanings, and as I say, I had a thing to defend myself, not even a stick or a stone. "There's only two of us here," it said again with a horrible moan. And it goes through like that, but at the end of it he says, "I'll never ever sleep in a hut again."
All right, okay.
So there's no logic in the story, or it's just a story.
Yeah. Did you learn that during the war or before the war, or?
No, it would have been long after the war.
After the war, okay.
Oh, yes.
I just pictured it being some sort of supernatural experience that, somebody
Yes.
had experienced.
No, I think the poem is self-explanatory.
Yeah.
It's not a story about something that happened.
Yeah. Oh, no, sure. Thank you for that, Les. And as he didn't clearly write that one himself, I now feel duty-bound to offer you one more PS, a story that our skillful scribe did not concoct himself. This is about Curly O'Grady. Curly O'Grady was several years older than most of us. And when we hit the Owen Stanley Mountains in New Guinea in 1942, he did it very hard. We'd stopped for a rest on one of those never-ending hills with their multitude of heartbreaking false crests. Too tired to take off our equipment, we just collapsed on the ground as we were. Curly started to swear with great venom, the tirade going on for several seconds. On being asked by a lethargic mate what was the matter, Curly asked, "Do you remember the Japanese earthquake and fire in 1923 when all those people in Tokyo were killed, injured and homeless?" Most of us were too young to remember, so were silent. Curly went on, "Someone came around where I was working asking for donations of money to help them out, and I gave them 10 bob. Now look what the bloomin' so-and-sos have done to me." Oh dear. Right, another PS. Warships and gun crews. Most of the troop ships I was on had been freighters. Unlike the American ships that were especially outfitted for carrying troops, we slept in hammocks on the British ships. Steel hooks were fixed on the ceilings of the cargo holds. The mess tables were bolted to the floors. When it was time to go to bed, the hammocks were slung on the hooks above the mess tables, and when we awoke they were rolled and packed in racks along the bulkhead. Contrary to a normal convoy, where the same escorting warships stayed with the convoy throughout the voyage, additional warships joined this convoy from time to time and sailed with it for a few days and just as suddenly disappeared. For a while we had the British 16-inch battleship Royal Sovereign, and it was comforting to have that huge ship sailing in the middle of the convoy. It would perhaps have been the only time on ships at sea during the whole war that we wouldn't have minded seeing a small enemy warship appear. Before we finish, I just want to squeeze in a tiny bit of feedback regarding the last episode about that miniature tank thing that could blow things up. It had been invented and it was being presented to a series of officers, and I think Les was present or he'd heard about it, and it could blow things up by remote control, and Les was bemoaning the fact that such a brilliant invention was never taken seriously by the army. He thought it could have been of major benefit. Now, last episode I was trying to remember if we'd covered such an invention previously, and up popped Frank Papalia from America and his young son and fighting through honorary captain James Papalia to point out that such an invention was used by the Germans against the American forces landing on D-Day. And if anybody wants to catch up on that, it was on the D-Day Through German Eyes episode 47. And the bit about the Goliath, which is what it was called, was covered from 79 minutes onwards. I'm putting a link in the show notes, which is a direct link to a play button, and it'll be in a variety of players. So thank you, Frank and James, for that. That was driving me mad trying to remember where it was. This is one final PS, and it's called The Oath of Enlistment in the Australian Imperial Force. And I'm including this next piece, which I found amongst the papers Tony sent to me, and it's the Oath of Enlistment, which Les obviously typed out sometime, and I can't help feeling that Les took it to heart and much more. I, Les Cook, swear that I will well and truly serve our Sovereign Lord the King in the military forces of the Commonwealth of Australia until the cessation of the present time of war and 12 months thereafter, or until sooner lawfully discharged, dismissed or removed, and that I will resist His Majesty's enemies and cause His Majesty's peace to be kept and maintained, and that I will, in all matters appertaining to my service, faithfully discharge my duty according to law. So help me God. Well, Les, from everything we've heard from you in your absolutely epic memoirs and the interview, and the things you've laid down as your rules of decent, civilised behaviour, there's going to be no doubt in any of the listeners' minds that you delivered in spades, sir. So on that note, I'll say thank you so much for your dedication to the cause of peace on this planet. One of my takeaways from these last 2 episodes, and indeed Leslie's earlier stories, is how the Australians seem to have been absolutely ready to play their part in fighting for world peace, with allies who, when it came to the crunch, had no reservations about mutual support and trust, based on an unbreakable common bond of language and heritage. And although I know we will have foibles and fallouts about things like rugby and cricket, I am eternally grateful that we are still firm friends when it comes to certain things. God bless all you nations who featured in this podcast as allies, and long may that unbroken bond continue to hold and our firm friendship prosper. I, for one, appreciate and value it. I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now.
I'm Les Cook. Goodbye.